"Sign here," the banker said, sliding the paper toward me, his voice careful, almost respectful, like he already knew this wasn't going to end the way my parents expected, and I watched my mother's fingers tighten around her purse while my father leaned forward just enough to pretend he still had some control over the situation, but the truth was sitting right there in black ink, $2,147,000 owed, and one signature away from survival, mine, and as I looked at that number, I didn't see debt, I saw a memory. I saw a single piece of paper from 12 years ago, folded twice, left on a kitchen counter, with exactly $100 inside it, nothing more, nothing else, no note, no explanation, just cash and silence, and I remember how my hand shook back then too, standing in that same kind of quiet, except that silence felt colder, heavier, like the air itself had decided I didn't belong in it anymore, and I didn't know it then, but that moment would define everything that came after, every decision, every risk, every dollar I would eventually build, because back then I wasn't sitting in a bank in downtown Chicago wearing a tailored coat and holding control over millions. I was an 18-year-old girl staring at a locked front door, trying to understand how a family becomes strangers in less than 10 seconds. I can still hear my father's voice from that morning, flat, almost bored. "You're on your own now, Lauren," like he was canceling a subscription instead of cutting off his daughter, and my mother didn't say anything, she just avoided eye contact, which somehow hurt more, because silence feels permanent, words at least can be taken back, and I stood there for a long time after the door closed, longer than I should admit, holding that envelope, not crying, not yelling, just waiting, like maybe this was some kind of test and they'd open the door again and say they didn't mean it, but they didn't. And eventually I had to accept the only thing that was real in that moment, the weight of that envelope, light enough to feel like a joke, heavy enough to decide my future, $100, that was the number they assigned to me, the value of everything I was to them, and I remember walking to the nearest ATM because I needed to see it on a screen to believe it, needed the confirmation that this was actually happening, and when the balance showed $100, perfectly centered, bright against the dark background, I felt something inside me shift, not break, not yet, just shift, like a door closing somewhere deep that I didn't know existed, and I checked it again, and again, as if the number might change if I stared long enough, but it didn't. It stayed the same, steady, indifferent, and I realized right there that nobody was coming to fix this. There was no backup plan, no hidden safety net, no second chance waiting behind the scenes, just me and a number that wouldn't stretch far enough to cover even a week of survival. And the strange part is I didn't panic, not immediately. I just started doing math in my head. Rent I couldn't afford, food I had to ration, gas I didn't have, and every calculation led to the same conclusion. I had maybe 3 days before that number dropped to zero, and then what? I didn't know. I just knew I couldn't go back, not after the way they looked at me, not after the way they didn't look at me, and as I stood there outside that ATM, I also knew something else, something I wouldn't fully understand until years later, that this wasn't just about money, it was about permission. They had decided I wasn't worth investing in, not emotionally, not financially, not at all. And that decision was supposed to define me, to limit me, to keep me small, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known in that moment, was that being left with nothing has a way of forcing you to become something, not overnight, not in some dramatic transformation, but slowly, painfully, through choices you don't even realize are shaping you until it's too late to go back. And I didn't know who I was going to become yet. I just knew I couldn't stay who I had been, the quiet one, the one who waited, the one who accepted less because it was easier than asking for more. That version of me wouldn't survive what was coming, and as I pulled the receipt from the machine and folded it into my pocket, I made a decision so small it almost didn't feel like a decision at all. I would not go back, no matter what happened next, no matter how hard it got, no matter how many times I questioned that choice. I would not go back to a place where my value was measured in a single envelope, and standing here now, years later, watching my parents sit across from me in a bank they can't afford to impress people who won't remember them, waiting for me to decide whether their story ends in recovery or collapse. I can see exactly how that moment outside the ATM led me here. Every long night, every rejection, every dollar saved and lost and rebuilt, it all traces back to that screen, that number, that silence. And the truth is, they think this is about money again. They think this is just another transaction, another problem to solve, but they're wrong. This was never just about money. It was about who gets to decide what I'm worth. And 12 years ago, they made their decision. They left me with $100 and a closed door, and today, they're about to find out what that decision actually cost them. I learned early that in my family, love followed a ranking system, and I was never at the top of it. not even close, because there was always someone else who needed more, someone more promising, more worth the investment, and in our house that person was my older brother, Daniel, who could do no wrong even when he did nothing at all, while I became the one who adjusted, the one who understood, the one who made things easier for everyone else without ever being asked if it was easy for me, and it did not happen all at once. It was a pattern, quiet at first, almost invisible if you were not looking for it, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it, like the way my 16th birthday turned into a celebration for Daniel because he had just made varsity basketball, and my cake sat untouched on the counter while my parents toasted to his future, or the way my college acceptance letter arrived on the same day Daniel needed help covering a credit card bill he had ignored for months, and suddenly the conversation shifted from my future to his emergency, and I remember standing in the kitchen holding that letter, waiting for someone to say something, anything, but my mother just glanced at it and said, "That is nice, Lauren," before turning back to Daniel, and my father did not even look up from his phone, and moments like that started to stack, one on top of another, until they formed something solid, something undeniable, a structure I was living inside without realizing it was being built around me, and every time I needed something, even something small, there was always a reason it could not happen, always a justification that sounded reasonable on the surface. "We have to be practical, money is tight, your brother needs this right now, you understand, do not you, Lauren?" And I always said yes, because saying no felt like making things worse, like proving whatever quiet assumption they already had about me, that I was difficult, that I was asking for too much, so I learned to need less, to want less, to expect less. And I got good at it, so good that by the time I was 17, I could predict the outcome of any conversation before it even started. I knew which dreams were safe to mention, and which ones would be dismissed before I finished the sentence. I knew how to shrink my expectations to fit whatever space they left for me, and for a while, I convinced myself that this was normal, that every family worked like this in some way, that someone always had to be the one who adjusted, and it just happened to be me. But the truth started to surface in small, uncomfortable moments, like the night I overheard my parents talking in the living room when they thought I was asleep, my father saying, "We cannot keep spreading ourselves thin, we need to focus on what makes sense long term," and my mother responding, "Daniel has potential, Lauren will figure something out, she always does," and there was no anger in her voice, no hesitation, just certainty, like she was stating a fact that did not need to be questioned, and that sentence stayed with me, louder than anything they had ever said. Directly to my face, because it explained everything without needing further clarification. I was not someone they planned for, I was someone they assumed would adapt, and that assumption became the foundation of every decision they made, every resource they allocated, every opportunity they chose to support or ignore, and I can trace it through years of small choices that added up to something much bigger, like how Daniel got a car at 17 because it would help him get to practice, while I got rides when they were available, or how his college applications came with tutoring and test prep and application fees covered without question, while mine were met with suggestions to consider community college to save money, not because I was less capable but because I was less prioritized, and I remember the exact moment it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a conclusion. It was the day I asked for $200 to secure my enrollment deposit, a deadline I had worked toward for years, and my mother looked at me with a kind of tired patience and said, "You are smart, Lauren, you will figure it out, we cannot help you right now," and then later that same evening, I watched them transfer money to Daniel to cover another one of his expenses, no discussion, no hesitation, just done, and that was the moment something shifted again, deeper this time, because it was no longer about individual moments, it was about what those moments revealed, that I was not overlooked by accident, I was positioned there on purpose, quietly, consistently, until it became normal, until even I started to believe it, and that belief followed me all the way to that morning, the envelope, the door, the $100, because by the time they said "you are on your own," it was not a sudden decision, it was the final step in a pattern they had been building for years, a pattern where I was always the one expected to survive without support, and the truth is, they were right about one thing, I did figure it out, just not in the way they expected. The first night I slept in my car, I told myself it was temporary, just a few hours until I figured something out, just a pause between what my life had been, and what it was supposed to become, but time feels different when you do not know where you are going next, it stretches, it slows, it forces you to sit with thoughts you used to avoid, and I remember gripping the steering wheel long after I turned the engine off, staring at the dark windshield like it might offer answers if I waited long enough, but it did not, it just reflected me back to myself, tired, uncertain, and for the first time, completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with realization, because it was one thing to feel overlooked in a house full of people. It was another to understand that there was no house anymore, no fallback, no one to call if things went wrong, and I checked my phone out of habit even though I already knew there would be nothing there, no messages, no missed calls, no sudden change of heart, just silence, consistent and absolute, and I wish I could say I handled that moment with strength or clarity, but the truth is I just sat there trying to make sense of how quickly everything had shifted, how a life that once felt predictable could collapse into uncertainty overnight, and eventually I reached into my pocket and pulled out the receipt from the ATM again, smoothing it out under the dim overhead light, reading the same number like it might anchor me to something real, $100, and I started calculating again, not because it would change anything, but because numbers were the only thing that still felt stable. If I spent $5 on food, that left 95, if I found somewhere cheap to stay, that number would drop faster than I could recover it, and every scenario led to the same conclusion: I had to stretch that $100 as far as possible. Not days, but hours mattered now, and that is when survival stopped being abstract and became specific, immediate, and very real. So I drove, not far, just enough to feel like I was moving instead of stuck, and I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store because it was well lit and there were other cars around, which made it feel safer. And I remember watching people walk in and out with bags of things they did not have to think twice about buying, things that had always been normal to me before, things I had never assigned value to beyond their price tag, and now every item represented a choice, a trade, something I could not afford to waste, and I stayed there longer than I expected, not because I had somewhere better to go, but because leaving meant accepting that this was my reality, and at some point, exhaustion caught up with me and I leaned the seat back just enough to close my eyes, telling myself it was just for a minute, just long enough to rest, but sleep did not come easily. It came in fragments, interrupted by every sound, every movement, every passing car, and each time I woke up there was a split second where I forgot where I was, where I expected to be in my bed, in my room, in a place that made sense, and then it would hit again, the memory, the door, the envelope, and that weight would settle back in my chest, heavier each time, and sometime around 3 in the morning, I realized something I had not been ready to admit before: this was not temporary unless I made it temporary. Nothing was going to change unless I forced it to change, and that thought was not comforting, it was terrifying, because it meant every outcome from this point forward depended entirely on me, my decisions, my actions, my ability to adapt to a situation I had never been prepared for. And I sat up in the driver's seat, adjusting the mirror even though there was no reason to, just needing to do something, anything that made me feel like I had some control. And I looked at myself, really looked this time, not as the version my family had defined, not as the one who adjusted and accepted and stayed quiet, but as someone who had no choice left but to become something else, and I did not know what that looked like yet. I did not have a plan, I did not have resources, but I had one thing they had underestimated: I had reached a point where failing was no longer an option because there was nothing left to fall back on, and that changes how you think, how you act, how you move through the world. It sharpens everything. And as the sky started to lighten just slightly, the first hint of morning breaking through the darkness, I made another decision, just as small and just as important as the one I made outside that ATM. I was going to treat that $100 like it was the beginning of something, not the end, because if I saw it as the end, then they were right about me, and I was not ready to give them that yet, not after everything, not after the way they had already decided who I was supposed to be. Morning did not feel like a fresh start, it felt like a deadline, like something had officially begun whether I was ready or not. And I remember sitting in that driver's seat as the sun came up over the grocery store parking lot, watching employees arrive for their shifts, watching normal life continue around me as if nothing had changed, even though everything had changed for me. And the first thing I did was check my phone again out of instinct. Still nothing, no message from my parents, no apology, no second thought, just silence that now felt intentional instead of temporary, and that realization settled something inside me, not in a comforting way, but in a clarifying one, because it removed any remaining illusion that this situation might reverse itself, and once that illusion was gone, I could finally focus on what was actually in front of me, the next few hours, the next decision, the next dollar. And I looked at the clock on the dashboard, 6:42 a.m., and told myself I had until noon to figure out a way to turn that $100 into something sustainable, not long-term, just enough to get through the next day, and that shift in thinking mattered more than anything else, because instead of trying to solve everything at once, I started breaking it down into smaller problems I could actually manage: food, a place to clean up, a way to make money, and I started with the simplest one: food. Walking into that same grocery store, I had been sitting outside of 4 hours, aware of every step, every dollar, every choice, and I remember picking up a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, doing the math in my head, calculating how many meals that could stretch into, how long I could make it last if I was careful. And when I got to the register and the total came out to $6.37, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety: relief that I could still afford something, anxiety because that number meant my margin was shrinking, and as the cashier handed me the receipt, I realized I was now tracking every cent in a way I never had before, not casually, not as a habit, but as a necessity. And I took that bag back to the car and ate slowly, deliberately, like I was trying to make the moment last longer than it needed to, because once it was gone, and after that, I needed a plan for the next part: making money, and the truth is I did not have any experience that felt immediately useful, no connections, no safety net, just a high school diploma, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary, and that willingness became my starting point, because I realized something important in that moment: I did not need the perfect opportunity. I needed any opportunity, something small, something imperfect, something that could move me forward even one step. And I spent the next few hours walking into places that had hiring signs: coffee shops, diners, retail stores, asking if they needed help, hearing the same responses over and over: fill out an application online, we will call you, we are not hiring right now. And each rejection chipped away at something inside me, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like water wearing down stone. And there were moments where I wanted to stop, to go back to the car and pretend this was not happening, but I could not afford that. Not emotionally, not financially, so I kept going, adjusting my approach, speaking a little more confidently, standing a little straighter, trying to present a version of myself that felt more certain than I actually was. And sometime in the early afternoon, after what felt like dozens of attempts, I walked into a small diner on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that did not look like it had changed in years, where the booths were worn but clean and the air smelled like coffee and something warm and familiar, and I almost did not go in because it did not look like the kind of place that would be hiring, but I had reached a point where assumptions did not matter anymore, only action did. So I stepped inside, and a woman behind the counter looked up at me, not with impatience, not with disinterest, but with a kind of quiet attention that caught me off guard. And when I asked if they were hiring, she did not immediately say no. She just studied me for a second and then said, "Can you start today?" And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, because nothing had come that easily all day, and I hesitated just long enough to realize that hesitation was a luxury I could not afford anymore. So I said yes, without asking about pay, without asking about hours, without asking anything at all, because at that point, the only thing that mattered was that it was something, a first step, a way to move forward instead of staying stuck. And I did not know it then, but that moment, that simple question and answer, would be the first real shift in everything that came next. The first shift felt longer than any day I had ever lived, not because of the hours, but because every minute carried weight, every task mattered in a way it never had before. And I remember standing behind that counter with an apron that was slightly too big, trying to memorize everything at once: the menu, the register, the rhythm of the place, while also trying to hide the fact that just hours earlier, I had been sitting in my car wondering how I was going to survive the week. And the woman who hired me, her name was Carol, did not ask many questions. She just showed me what needed to be done and expected me to keep up, which in some ways was a relief, because explanations would have required vulnerability I was not ready to give. And I threw myself into the work immediately, not out of passion, but out of necessity, because I understood something very clearly: this was not just a job, this was a lifeline, and I treated it that way. I watched how the other employees moved, how they handled customers, how they balanced speed and accuracy, and I adjusted as quickly as I could, even when my feet started to ache after the first few hours, even when my hand shook slightly as I counted change, because mistakes were not just mistakes anymore, they were risks I could not afford. And I kept thinking about the number in my pocket, the remaining balance, subtracting what I had already spent, calculating how long I could stretch what was left if this job turned into something consistent. And sometime in the middle of that shift, during a brief moment when the diner quieted down, Carol handed me a glass of water and said, "You are learning fast, do not overthink it, just keep moving." And it was such a simple statement, but it landed differently than anything I had heard in a long time, because it was not dismissive, it was not minimizing, it was an Acknowledgement, small but real, and I did not realize how much I needed that until I heard it, and I nodded, not trusting myself to say more than thank you, and went right back to work, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant drifting back to everything I was trying to push forward from, and by the time my shift ended, my entire body felt different, tired in a way that was earned, not imposed. And Carol handed me a small envelope with cash inside. Daily pay, she said, we settle up at the end of each shift, and for a second, I just stared at it, because that envelope felt nothing like the one I had been given the day before. This one had weight to it, not just physically, but in what it represented. And when I stepped outside and opened it, counting the bills carefully under the fading afternoon light, $38, it was not a lot, not by any standard I used to have, but in that moment, it felt significant because it was mine, something I had created through effort, not something that had been handed to me as a dismissal, and I added it to what I had left, doing the math again, watching the number climb slightly instead of shrink, and that small shift changed something inside me, because for the first time since everything fell apart, I could see a direction, not a clear path, not a guarantee, but a direction, forward instead of down, and I sat in my car again that evening, in the same parking lot that had felt so uncertain the night before, and it felt different now, not comfortable, not secure, but different, like I had taken the first step out of something instead of just reacting to it, and I remember looking at that new total, $131.63, and thinking how strange it was that such a small number could feel like progress, like proof that I was not stuck, that I could move this forward inch by inch if I had to, and I did not know how long it would take. I did not know what the end would look like, but I knew this, I was no longer at zero, and that mattered more than anything else, because it meant they were not completely right about me. It meant that the story they had already decided for me was not finished yet, and as I leaned back in the seat, exhaustion finally catching up in a way I could not fight anymore, I realized something else, something quieter but just as important. I had stopped waiting for them to change their minds, and that, more than the money, more than the job, was the real beginning of everything that came next. The next few days blurred together in a way that only happens when survival becomes routine, not because anything was easy, but because there was no room left for hesitation. Every morning started before sunrise, every night ended in the same driver's seat that was slowly becoming less of a temporary solution and more of a system I had to manage, and what surprised me most was not how hard it was, but how quickly I adapted to it, how quickly discomfort became normal, how quickly I stopped questioning whether I could do this and started focusing on how to do it better, and I built small routines, because routines create stability even when everything else is uncertain. I parked in the same areas, rotated between a few safe locations, kept track of which places stayed quiet through the night, and which ones did not. I found a public gym that offered a low monthly rate and signed up, not because I had extra money to spend, but because access to a shower and a place to reset physically made everything else possible, and I calculated that cost carefully, subtracting it from what I was earning, making sure it did not push me backward, because every decision still came down to numbers, and those numbers were starting to change, slowly but consistently, each shift at the diner adding a little more, each day ending with a total that was slightly higher than the day before, and I tracked it all in a small notebook I kept in the glove compartment, writing down every dollar earned, every dollar spent, not out of habit, but out of necessity, because I needed to see progress in order to believe in it, and there were moments when that progress felt almost invisible, like when an entire day of work only translated into a small increase, barely noticeable when compared to how much I still needed, but I learned not to measure it that way. I learned to focus on movement instead of distance, because distance can overwhelm you, but movement, even small movement, keeps you going, and Carol started to notice that I was not just showing up, I was improving, picking up shifts, staying late when someone called out, asking questions about how things worked beyond just my assigned tasks, and one evening after closing, while we were counting the register, she looked at me and said, "You are not here just to get by, are you?" And I paused for a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I had not said it out loud before, and I shook my head and said no, and she nodded like that confirmed something she had already suspected, and that moment mattered more than I realized at the time, because it was the first time someone saw me as more than just someone trying to survive. They saw intention, and that shifted how I started to see myself as well, not just reacting to circumstances but actively shaping what came next. And I began paying closer attention to everything around me, not just at the diner, but outside of it, how people spent money, how small businesses operated, how decisions were made that affected outcomes, because I started to understand that earning money was one thing, but understanding how it moved, how it grew, how it multiplied, that was something different entirely. And I did not have formal training, I did not have guidance, but I had observation and time. And I used both, watching customers talk about deals, listening to conversations I might have ignored before, asking small questions when it felt appropriate, building a picture piece by piece. And it was slow, almost unnoticeable in the beginning, but it planted something in me that would later become much bigger than I could see at that moment, and the numbers in my notebook kept changing. $131, then $170, then $212, and each increase, no matter how small, reinforced the same idea. I was building something, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, and that steadiness became more valuable than anything else, because it proved that progress did not require perfect conditions, it required consistency. And as the days turned into weeks, the version of me sitting in that car began to feel less like someone who had been left behind, and more like someone who was moving forward on her own terms, even if those terms were still being defined one day at a time. There was a point, somewhere between my third week and my second month, where survival stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a system I could improve, and that shift changed everything, because once you are no longer just reacting, you begin to see opportunities that were always there but invisible before, and I started noticing patterns not just in my own routine, but in the way money moved through the diner, the way certain hours were busier than others, the way regular customers ordered the same meals at the same time every week, the way small changes in service affected tips and turnover, and I realized that even in a place as simple as that diner, there was structure, there was flow, there were decisions being made that created results, and I became curious in a way I had not allowed myself to be before, not about abstract ideas, but about practical outcomes. What makes something work better, what makes it grow? And one night after closing, while I was wiping down tables and Carol was going over the books at the counter, I asked her a question I had been thinking about for days. How do you know if the business is doing well? And she looked up at me, surprised, not by the question itself, but by the fact that I was asking it, and she did not answer right away. She just studied me for a moment and then said, "You look at the numbers, but more importantly, you understand what those numbers mean," and she turned the small ledger toward me, pointing at columns I had seen before but never paid attention to: daily revenue, expenses, inventory costs, and for the first time, those numbers felt different. They were not just records, they were stories. They showed patterns, trends, decisions that had consequences, and I stood there longer than I needed to, asking more questions than I expected to ask, and she answered them without hesitation, not simplifying things, not dismissing my curiosity, just explaining, and something clicked for me in that moment. Not fully, not completely, but enough to spark something that had not been there before, and I started paying closer attention to everything, not just what I earned, but how it was earned, not just what I spent, but why it was spent, and I began making small adjustments in my own approach, picking up shifts during peak hours when tips were higher, learning how to anticipate customer needs so I could serve more tables efficiently, not rushing but optimizing, and those changes started to show up. In my notebook, the numbers moving a little faster, $200 became $280, then $350, and it was still not enough to change my situation overnight, but it was enough to show me that growth was possible, that effort combined with awareness could create results, and that realization made me think beyond the diner, beyond the immediate, because for the first time, I was not just thinking about how to survive the next day, I was thinking about how to build something that lasted longer than a shift, longer than a paycheck, and that is when I started spending my limited free time differently, not resting as much as I probably should have, but sitting in the corner of the diner after closing, reading whatever I could find about money, about small businesses, about how people turn small amounts into something larger, using my phone when I had access, writing down ideas in that same notebook where I tracked my expenses, and it was not structured, it was not organized, but it was consistent, and consistency started to compound in ways I did not fully understand yet, and the more I learned, the more I realized how little I knew, which could have been discouraging, but instead it felt motivating, because it meant there was room to grow, room to improve, room to change the trajectory I had been placed on. And I remember one specific night, sitting in my car with the overhead light on, flipping through the pages of my notebook, seeing the numbers from my first day compared to where I was now, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond just getting by. I allowed myself to imagine what it would look like to actually get ahead, not in a vague, unrealistic way, but in a calculated, step-by-step way. And that thought stayed with me longer than anything else had, because it was new, it was unfamiliar, and it was powerful, and I did not know exactly where it would lead yet, but I knew it was different from anything I had done before, and that difference was enough to keep me moving forward. The idea did not come to me all at once, it built slowly, piece by piece, from everything I had been observing, everything I had been tracking, and one afternoon during a slower shift, I noticed something I had overlooked before, a customer complaining quietly about a small issue with their order, not angry, not dramatic, just dissatisfied, and the way it was handled made the difference between them leaving frustrated or coming back the next day, and that moment stayed with me longer than it should have, because it showed me something simple but important. Value was not just in what you provided, it was in how you provided it, and that idea started to connect with everything else I had been learning, about money, about patterns, about consistency, and I began to think beyond the diner again, not in a distant way, but in a practical one. What small problems existed that people would pay to have solved? What simple improvements could create value where others were not paying attention? And I started looking at everything differently, the way items were stocked in stores, the way small businesses presented themselves, the way time was spent or wasted, and it was not long before I noticed something specific, something that kept repeating: local listings online, small items being sold quickly at low prices, and I started paying attention to those listings, how they were written, how they were priced, how quickly they disappeared, and I realized there was a pattern. There are items undervalued, sold quickly by people who wanted convenience over profit, and buyers who were willing to pay more for better presentation or easier access, and that gap, small as it was, felt like an opportunity, not a guaranteed one, not an easy one, but a starting point, and I did not act on it immediately because acting meant risk, and risk meant potentially losing what little I had built so far, and I sat with that hesitation for longer than I want to admit, weighing the numbers in my notebook, calculating what I could afford to lose without setting myself back completely, and that calculation became its own kind of turning point, because for the first time, I was not just thinking about how to protect what I had, I was thinking about how to use it, and those are two very different mindsets. One keeps you safe, the other moves you forward, and eventually, after days of watching, calculating, and second-guessing, I made a decision that felt both small and significant at the same time. I set aside $50, not for food, not for gas, not for anything immediate, but as a test, an experiment, something I could afford to lose if it did not work, and I remember holding that amount in my hand, thinking about how carefully I had built it up, how many hours it represented, how many shifts, how many small choices, and the idea of risking it made my chest tighten in a way that felt almost physical. But I also knew something else: if I never took that step, I would stay exactly where I was, moving slowly, but never breaking out of the cycle, and that realization pushed me forward, just enough to act, and the first item I bought was nothing impressive, nothing that stood out, just something I believed I could improve, something I could present better, something I could sell for slightly more than I paid, and when I brought it back to my car, looking at it under the same overhead light I had used to track my expenses, I felt the same mix of uncertainty and determination I had felt on my first day, because this was new, unfamiliar, and there were no guarantees, and I spent time making small adjustments, cleaning it, photographing it, writing a better description, things that seemed minor but felt intentional, and when I finally posted it online, I did not expect much. I told myself it was just a test, just a way to learn, but even then, I checked my phone more often than I should have, watching for any response, any sign that this idea might actually work, and when the first message came through, simple and direct, asking if it was still available, I stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, because it felt like more than just a question. It felt like confirmation that I was not just guessing anymore, that there was something real here, something I could build on, and I responded carefully, setting a price slightly higher than I had paid, not aggressively, just enough to test the margin, and when they agreed without hesitation, I felt something shift again, deeper this time, because it was not about the amount, it was about the process, the fact that I had taken something small and created more from it, and that idea, simple as it was, carried more weight than any paycheck I had received so far, because it was not limited by hours, it was not tied to a shift, it was something I could expand, refine, repeat, and as I completed that first small transaction, counting the difference in my hand, I realized I was no longer just earning money, I was learning how to make it work for me, and that difference would change everything that came next. The first profit I made was not impressive by any normal standard, it was just a small difference between what I paid and what I sold, but the impact it had on how I thought was far bigger than the number itself, because it proved something I had not fully believed before, that I could create value out of almost nothing if I paid enough attention and acted with intention, and that realization stayed with me the next day, And the day after that, following me into every shift at the diner, every moment I had to think, and I found myself looking for the next opportunity almost automatically, not obsessively, but consistently, like a habit that was forming without me forcing it, and I repeated the process, carefully at first, taking small risks, buying items I understood, improving them in ways that made sense, presenting them better, pricing them with just enough margin to test the pattern again, and not every attempt worked the same way. Some items took longer to sell, some barely broke even, and a few did not sell at all right away, which forced me to adjust, to learn patience, to understand that not every decision would produce immediate results, and that was an important lesson, because it kept me grounded. It kept me from assuming that early success meant guaranteed outcomes, and I tracked everything the same way I tracked my income from the diner, every dollar invested, every return, every mistake, writing it all down in that same notebook that had started as a survival tool, and was slowly becoming something more strategic, and over time, the numbers began to show a pattern that was hard to ignore, small gains stacking on top of each other, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, consistently, and what surprised me most was not just the increase itself, but how my confidence started to shift alongside it, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet certainty that I could handle more than I thought I could, and that certainty led me to make slightly bigger decisions, not reckless ones, but calculated ones, setting aside a little more each time, expanding what I was willing to try, testing different categories, different price points, always with the same approach, observe, adjust, repeat, and the more I did it, the more I began to understand something deeper about how money actually worked. It was not just about earning it through time, it was about positioning it in a way that allowed it to grow, even if that growth started small. And I remember one evening, sitting in my car again, flipping through the pages of my notebook, seeing the progression from my first $50 risk to where I was now, a few $100s moving through each cycle, and realizing that I was no longer just covering my expenses, I was creating a surplus, something I could reinvest instead of immediately spending, and that shift felt different than anything I had experienced so far, because it meant I was starting to build momentum, and momentum changes how you think, it changes how you plan, it changes what you believe is possible, and I began to look further ahead, not just days or weeks, but months, asking myself what this could look like if I stayed consistent. If I kept learning, if I kept refining the process instead of rushing it, and around that time, Carol noticed the change in me again, not just in how I worked, but in how I carried myself, the way I approached tasks with more intention, the way I asked different kinds of questions, and one night, after we closed, she said, "You are not going to stay here forever, are you?" And I paused, because a few weeks earlier, I might not have known how to answer that, but now the answer felt clearer, and I said no, not because I was ungrateful, but because I had started to see a path beyond this place, and she nodded, not surprised, just acknowledging what was already evident, and that moment reinforced something important, that growth is visible, even when it feels internal. And as I drove away that night, looking at the total in my notebook again, now higher than it had ever been since that first day, I realized something that would stay with me long after. This was no longer about recovering from what I had lost, it was about building something that had never been given to me in the first place, something entirely my own. And that difference changed everything about how I moved forward from that point on. Momentum does not announce itself when it arrives, it builds quietly until one day you realize you are no longer where you started, and that realization came to me in a way I did not expect, not through a big moment or a dramatic change, but through a simple comparison in my notebook, a series of numbers that told a story more clearly than anything else could. I remember sitting in my car late at night, flipping back to the first pages where every dollar had felt like a decision between survival and loss, and then flipping forward to where I was now, where those same dollars had begun to multiply through repetition, through consistency, through a system I had built without even realizing I was building it, and I saw the difference clearly, not just in the total, but in the rate of change, the way small gains had started to stack faster, the way each cycle of buying and selling fed into the next one, and for the first time, I stopped thinking in terms of days and started thinking in terms of scale, not in a reckless way, but in a calculated one, asking myself what would happen if I increased the size of each step while keeping the same discipline, the same process, the same attention to detail, and that question led to another decision, one that felt bigger than any I had made so far. I set aside a larger portion of what I had built, not all of it, never all of it, but enough to test whether the system could hold at a higher level, and I remember feeling that same tension in my chest that I had felt the first time I risked $50, but this time it was different, because now I had evidence, now I had patterns, now I had something to rely on beyond instinct, and I moved forward with that, carefully selecting items with more value, more potential, applying everything I had learned about presentation, pricing, timing. And I watched closely as those decisions played out, not expecting perfection, but expecting feedback, and the results came faster than I anticipated, not because I was lucky, but because the system was working. The same principles applied at a larger scale produced larger outcomes, and that realization changed the way I approached everything, because it showed me that growth was not random, it was structured, it followed rules that could be understood and repeated. And as my side income began to approach and then surpass what I was earning at the diner, I faced another decision, one that felt less about survival and more about direction, whether to stay where I was comfortable or to commit fully to what I was building. And that decision took longer than I expected, not because I doubted the numbers, but because I understood the risk of letting go of something stable, even if it was limited. And I talked to Carol about it one evening after closing, not asking for permission, but for perspective. And she listened quietly before saying something that stayed with me: stability is not always the same as progress, and sometimes holding on too tightly to what is safe keeps you from moving forward. And I thought about that for a long time, weighing what I had built against what I might lose, and eventually, I made the choice that aligned with everything I had been learning. I reduced my hours at the diner, not all at once, but gradually, creating more time to focus on the system I was building. And that shift allowed me to increase my output, to refine my process further, to handle more volume without sacrificing quality. And the numbers reflected that almost immediately, growing at a pace that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. And with that growth came another change, one I had been working toward without fully realizing it. I moved out of my car, not into something large or impressive, but into a small studio apartment that represented something much bigger than its size: stability on my own terms, a place that existed because of decisions I had made, not because of anything I had been given. And I remember standing in that empty space the first night, looking around at walls that were mine to define, and feeling a kind of quiet clarity that I had not experienced before, because for the first time, everything around me was the result of my own actions, my own choices, my own persistence. And as I sat on the floor with my notebook open beside me, adding up the latest numbers, I realized something that shifted my perspective once again. This was no longer about catching up to where I should have been. This was about building something that could go far beyond anything I had originally imagined. And that realization carried with it a sense of responsibility, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to continue the process that had brought me this far, because now I understood what it was capable of becoming. Success does not feel like a finish line when you are inside it. It feels like pressure, like a quiet expectation that you now have something to maintain, something to protect. And that realization came to me the first time I saw my total pass a number I had never imagined reaching on my own, not because it changed anything immediately, but because it changed what was at stake. Because once you build something from nothing, you understand exactly how fragile it can be if you stop paying attention. And I remember sitting at the small desk in my apartment, the same notebook open in front of me, but now filled with pages of numbers that told a much larger story than they used to. And for a moment, I just stared at the total, letting it settle, not celebrating, not reacting, just acknowledging that this was real, that this was the result of months of consistent effort, and that it could disappear just as quickly if I became careless. And that thought kept me grounded in a way that nothing else could, because it reminded me that growth was not permanent. It had to be maintained, refined, protected. And I started approaching everything with a different level of discipline, not just repeating what had worked, but improving it, tightening the process, reducing mistakes, paying attention to details I might have overlooked before. And I expanded beyond the small items I had started with, moving into larger transactions that required more planning, more analysis, more patience. And with that expansion came new challenges, delays, unexpected issues, decisions that did not always go the way I anticipated. And there were moments where I questioned whether I was moving too fast, whether I was taking on more than I could handle. But each time I faced those moments, I went back to the same principles that had carried me from the beginning: observe, adjust, repeat. And that consistency kept everything stable even as the scale increased. And over time, what had once been a side effort became the primary focus of everything I did, not because I forced it, but because it naturally grew into that role. And I structured my days around it, creating routines that allowed me to operate more efficiently, to handle more volume without losing control. And that structure created something I had never experienced before: predictability within growth, a sense that I was not just reacting to opportunities, but actively creating them. And that shift gave me the confidence to make one of the biggest decisions I had made so far. I stopped working at the diner entirely, Not abruptly, but with intention, making sure that what I had built could sustain itself without that support, and when I walked out of that place for the last time, it did not feel like leaving something behind, it felt like completing a chapter, one that had been necessary, one that had taught me more than I realized at the time, and I carried those lessons with me into everything that came next, and as my operation continued to grow, I began to notice something else, something I had not anticipated. People started to see the results before they understood the process. They saw the outcomes, the visible changes, the apartment, the stability, the consistency, and they began to ask questions, not in a critical way, but in a curious one. How did you do it? What are you working on? And for a while, I kept my answers simple. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I understood that the details would not make sense without the context, without the months of uncertainty, the small decisions, the consistent effort that led to those results, and I did not feel the need to explain it fully, because I knew what it had taken, I knew where it started, and that was enough for me. And yet, even as things stabilized, even as the numbers continued to grow, there was a part of my past that had remained completely silent, unchanged, untouched by everything that had happened since, and I had almost forgotten what that silence felt like until one evening, as I was reviewing my latest numbers, my phone lit up with a number I had not seen in a long time, a number I recognized immediately, and for a moment, I just stared at it, not answering, not reacting, just letting it ring, because I knew that whatever came next would not just be a conversation, it would be a collision between everything I had been and everything I had become, and I was not sure yet which version of me would respond. The phone stopped ringing before I made a decision, the screen going dark again like nothing had happened, but something had happened, something had shifted, because silence from them had always been the default, always been the constant, and the moment that silence broke, even briefly, it changed the way I felt in that room, and I set the phone down without touching it, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that timing mattered now, not just for them, but for me, and I needed to decide how I was going to approach this before I allowed it to unfold, and a few minutes later, the screen lit up again, this time with a voicemail notification, and I let it sit there for longer than necessary, finishing what I was doing. Closing my notebook, organizing the numbers in front of me as if that structure could extend into whatever came next, and when I finally pressed play, I did not expect the voice on the other end to sound the way it did, not confident, not controlled, but uncertain, almost careful, my mother's voice, softer than I remembered, saying my name like it had not been used in years, Lauren, we need to talk. And the choice of words stood out immediately, not we want to talk, not we would like to talk. But we need to talk, and that difference carried weight, because it suggested urgency, not connection, and she continued, her tone measured, explaining that they had been trying to reach me, that things had been complicated, that there were issues with the house, with finances, with things that had not gone the way they expected, and I listened without interrupting, without reacting, just taking in the information as it was presented, because for the first time, I was not emotionally inside that conversation. I was observing it, analyzing it the same way I had learned to analyze everything else, looking for patterns, looking for intent, and what stood out most was not what she said, but what she did not say. There was no acknowledgement of the past, no mention of that morning, no recognition of what had been done, just a shift directly into what they needed now, and when the message ended, I sat there in silence for a moment, letting it settle, not feeling anger, not feeling satisfaction, just clarity, because everything about that message confirmed what I had already understood. This was not about reconciliation, this was about necessity, and I checked the timestamp, realizing that they had called earlier that day, and again before that, multiple attempts, which meant this was not a casual reach-out, this was a situation that had been building on their end, and that realization led me to do something I had not done in a long time. I called the number back, not immediately, not impulsively, but with intention, and when my father answered, there was a pause on the line, like he was not expecting me to respond, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone I had never heard from him before, not authority, not certainty, but something closer to restraint. Lauren, he said, as if confirming that it was actually me, and I responded simply, yes, and for a second, neither of us said anything else, the silence stretching in a way that felt familiar but different at the same time, because this time, I was not waiting for approval, I was waiting for information, and he cleared his throat before continuing, explaining the situation in terms that were direct but incomplete. The house had been leveraged, there were debts, investments that had not worked out, obligations that had come due faster than expected, and as he spoke, I could piece together the outline of what had happened, not every detail, but enough to understand the scale, and then he said something that made everything else fall into place, we need your help, and there it was, stated clearly, without disguise, without hesitation, the purpose behind the call, and I asked one question, not emotionally, not defensively, but strategically. What exactly do you need? And the answer came quickly, too. Quickly, as if it had been rehearsed. There was a loan, a significant amount, tied to the property, and without intervention, they would lose everything connected to it, and intervention required capital, access, approval, things they no longer had on their own, and I listened, processing the numbers as he spoke them, comparing them to what I had built, calculating the gap between what they needed and what I could provide, and for a moment, it felt like any other decision I had made over the past months, an evaluation of risk and return, of potential outcomes and consequences, but there was one difference that could not be reduced to numbers. This was not a transaction, this was a convergence of two timelines that had been moving in completely opposite directions, and as I held the phone to my ear, hearing the expectation in his voice, I realized something that would define what came next. They still saw me as the same person they had left behind, the same person who would adjust, who would accommodate, who would fill the gap without questioning why it existed, and that assumption, more than anything else, told me exactly how I needed to respond. There was a long pause after he finished speaking, the kind of pause that would have once made me uncomfortable, the kind where I would have rushed to fill the silence just to make things easier for everyone else, but this time I let it stay exactly as it was, because I had learned that silence is not something to fear, it is something to use, and I could feel him waiting on the other end of the line, expecting a familiar response, expecting the version of me who would say yes before fully understanding the cost, and I took a slow breath before answering, not to calm myself, but to make sure every word was intentional, and I said, I understand the situation, and my voice sounded steady, almost distant, like I was speaking from a place he did not recognize, and he immediately started explaining more details, numbers, timelines, consequences, but I stopped him gently, not out of disrespect but because I already had enough information, and I said, I know what you are asking, and there was another pause, shorter this time, sharper, and then he said, so you can help. And the way he said it was not a question, it was an expectation, and that was the moment. Everything became completely clear, not because of what he needed, but because of how he assumed I would respond, and I thought back to that morning, the envelope, the door, the $100, not with anger, not with resentment, but with precision, because that moment had defined a boundary, whether they realized it or not, and I said something that I had not planned, but felt completely certain in. I said, I survived on what you gave me, and I am going to let you do the same, and there was silence on the line again, heavier this time, not uncertain, but final, and I could hear my mother in the background, asking what I said, and my father did not respond right away, and I did not wait for him to. I simply added, this is not about money, it never was, and then I ended the call, not abruptly, not emotionally, just definitively, and I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, not feeling the rush of victory or the weight of guilt, just a quiet sense of alignment, like everything I had done up to this point had led to this exact response, and for the first time, I understood what power actually felt like, not control over others, not the ability to change their situation, but the ability to choose my own boundaries without hesitation. And as I set the phone down and looked around my apartment, at the space I had built from nothing, at the life that existed because I refused to stay where I had been left, I realized that closure does not come from fixing the past, it comes from no longer needing it to be different. And that understanding changed something deeper than any financial success ever could, because it meant I was no longer connected to them through expectation or obligation, only through history, and history does not get to decide what happens next. And if there is anything this journey taught me, it is that people do not break from being left with nothing, they break from believing that nothing defines them, and the moment you decide it does not, everything begins to shift, slowly at first, almost unnoticeably, until one day you realize you are standing in a completely different place, not because someone helped you get there but because you chose to move, step by step, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was uncertain, and that is where real change lives, not in dramatic moments, but in consistent decisions. And if there is one thing I would want anyone listening to understand, it is this: the way people treat you can shape your starting point, but it does not get to determine your direction. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not prove them wrong, but simply build something so strong that their opinion no longer matters, because in the end, the goal is not to win against someone else, it is to become someone who no longer needs their approval to feel whole.